Hey friend, welcome back to the Created Worthy podcast. I am your host and fellow worthy warrior, Danielle Damrell. On this show, we are creating space for genuine connection by unifying women of all ages, backgrounds, and experiences. So grab your favorite drink and get ready to listen as we take a deep dive into our stories, making sure to honor and protect them in the process. We will also uncover the threads of creative processing that have already played a part in each of our lives. When we know how to utilize this as a skill, we can continue growing into the joy-filled, triumphant women we are created to be. You are created worthy. Wee-oo. So that was my attempt at a siren noise this season. If you weren't here last season, then you probably just think I'm a weirdo, and I can't even say that you're wrong. But nonetheless, here we are, and the reason I do those is because some episodes could be especially triggering. In this episode, we talk about subjects such as marital abuse, rape, suicide, and a variety of other sensitive subjects. So, if you think that there is any chance that you may get triggered, then I will encourage you to prioritize your mental and emotional well-being and just opt out of listening to this episode. It's okay. No hard feelings. Protect your peace. See, I told you I am weird. I can't help it. I was born this way. Welcome back to part 2 of Leah's story. If you haven't heard part 1, go back and listen to the previous episode. All right, let's jump back in.
That was kind of like the blessing in disguise. Again, my parents were out of town, so the decision was made because I couldn't be discharged into their care. I was going to be put into inpatient. So I had, I think...
like a 72-hour hold type of
thing? It was a 72-hour hold. I was admitted the evening of the 21st, and I was discharged on the 25th because that's when my parents got home. So they kept me a little bit longer, and I was pissed. But in hindsight, like, it was such a blessing because I had nothing to take care of for 4 days while I made my plan. Like, this is what I want. This is what I'm going to do. This is how I'm going to do it. And being discharged into my parents' care, I told them I don't want to go home. Yeah. I don't want to go back there. And so and that was the other tricky thing. They were out of town, but you can't have like video in inpatient. So like people would like talk to my parents and then call me. And then it was like this game of telephone. But I was discharged and my sisters picked me up. They took me to my house so I could pack whatever I needed. I was on high alert, so I changed all of the passwords on my computers that would be staying there, like made sure I got all of my toiletries and things, and was like, okay, like I need this to be safe, because I knew like I'm going to be communicating with lawyers, and if he can see that I'm talking to people, that's not okay. And then I went and I stayed with my parents. So this was end of February 2020. I was with them until September of 2020, living in their basement with my 2 children every other week.
Yeah. But you were safe.
I was safe. And that was the really beautiful thing. I talked earlier about like how I had some semblance of strained relationship with my parents, just because I was, and that was another, I'm going to backtrack a little bit.
That's okay.
After the separation in 2018, I talked about how that one therapist had given me the language, but wasn't actually helpful or healthy. Yeah. Like she was pretty sketchy. And I don't remember how I found her, but I found my current therapist. And she was amazing. She's a believer, but also acknowledges that verses don't hold all of the information we need to like psychologically process things.
Like our brains are science.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so there was a lot of like support in that. And with all of the things I had put Blythe through, and knowing I've made the decision now that I'm going to stay to make sure that Jude is safe, I got her into therapy. So Blythe was seeing a therapist, I think, every other week at that point.
Okay.
And so...
At any point, did your girls understand, like, did they know that you had attempted to take your life, or was that just something that she inherently
She just knew.
Felt.
And
Okay.
we've used a lot of language about like how I was really sick, about how being with their dad was making me sick, and that we wanted to be safe and healthy. And so it was safer and healthier for us to be apart. But I've never actually used suicide language with her.
Okay.
She's nearing an age where she's very curious about a lot of things. My husband's dad passed away last year, so we talk about death in our family. We talk about those things, and she's like very quick to open up that conversation with other people, and I think it stresses people out because they're like,
my kid is the exact same way.
You are 6, why are you asking if my dad's alive? Like, that's not a thing. So I'm very cautious about what kind of language I use with her, but we've talked a lot about how mom is healthy now, and I was there to help me get better, so that she had a strong understanding of like, this isn't something we're afraid is going to happen again. We did this to make sure we're okay. And so that was like a really big blessing, coming out of inpatient, being able to live with my parents, having that relationship with them, but then also having the support of my therapist and Blythe's therapist, knowing that she'd witnessed those things. She already had an appointment scheduled. So I was able to email her therapist and be like, sorry, I'm going to dump this on you, but this is what happened. Blythe might talk about it. This is what she said to me, but I wanted to give you a heads up. And that was something that was really beautiful too. It was just like seeing how God had orchestrated all this, where like she would have needed therapy and I would have sought it out if I hadn't already had her in therapy. But because she was already in therapy, she got to, you know, have these big things, but then meet with someone she loved and trusted already to process that. It wasn't this scary, like, new thing on top of a scary new thing. You know, it was like a comfortable thing for her. And living with my parents, like, that was something I was a little stressed about. I was a little unsure about, because I'd already done that and they had strong opinions the last time. But I remember there was a day where I was recounting the night that I had attempted suicide, and I got to the point where I was talking about being face down on the bed and saying no, and my dad stopped me and he said, wait, you were crying and you were saying no? And I was like, yes, Dad, like, that happened a lot. And he burst into tears and my mom burst into tears, and he was like, if your mom is crying, I'm stopping everything to make sure she's okay. Like, I'm stopping everything to make sure she's okay. And that was when it clicked for him, like, this is not okay. And from that moment on, like, he was like, I support your decision. Whatever you decide, I support your decision. And so they were actually really instrumental in helping me. They have a friend who's a lawyer who recommended a family law lawyer for doing the divorce and walking me through all that paperwork. And it was a long process. I knew that filing independently and serving him papers would make it take longer. And so I kind of held his hand in the process to get him to do it together. And so that's where it kind of gets to this really cool part, because I mean, to me, my marriage was over in 2018, but, you know, legally it wasn't. And so there was like this whole process of getting it to be legally over, because, you know, that's the funny thing. Like, people are like, in the church, legal doesn't matter until it's a marriage license. And it really,
so true.
Really, really, really matters to everyone. And so I was like, I need this to be over. And it was in this COVID hit, which was like blessing in disguise for me. And I don't say that lightly. I don't want to like discredit what COVID was to so many people, but so many people, like the circle I grew up in, Danielle, within 24 hours of me being admitted, hundreds of people knew that I had attempted suicide. And that was overwhelming, because people I hadn't talked to in 2 years were texting me, we want to get together, we want to talk to you, you know, we want to do this, we want to counsel you, we love you, like all these things. And I was like, I just can't. I just can't.
Yeah, that's overwhelming.
Like, it was so much. But then COVID hit and I was like, ha! I don't have to see any of you. And it's not that I didn't care about them, but I was like, you didn't care about me for 2 years. And now I almost die. And suddenly I matter. Like, I'm not interested in those kinds of relationships. And a really beautiful thing that came out of that was my best friend and her husband, who were not my best friend at the time. They heard at a group function that something had happened, and her husband was an assistant pastor. He was clergy. And so he learned that you can request clergy at any point in inpatient. And he came to the hospital before I was committed. to inpatient. He said, whatever you need, I'm here. Here's my number.
Wow.
Here's my credentials. I'll be there. And they were so powerful in
That's incredible.
keeping me tethered to God in a moment where I was just completely deconstructing everything. You know, like I caution to the wind was like, whatever, I don't need any of this right now. I need to rebuild. And they had the hard conversations with me. You know, they talked about if I was able to take care of my kids or if I couldn't and all those things. But then COVID hit. Literally discharged on the 25th. I think it was March 1st, right?
Yeah, the first week of March.
Yeah. And so like it was this thing, and they looked at me and they said, hey, we're all quarantining in our own homes, but we just saw you. So if you need a place to go that's not your parents' house, you can come be at our house.
You can be in our
And
bubble.
I was like, that's amazing. This is perfect. And Zach, my husband, was living with them. He was their roommate at the time. And so I was around him all the time. And like I said, I loved him when I was a teenager, and he broke my heart and moved to Texas and all that. And so we kind of had like these like
but good.
awkward, like we're still in the same circles, but not in the same circle, you know, like interactions. And so like, it was kind of like this awkward, like song and dance where like Mallory quickly became my closest friend. She held my hand literally in the dumps of life and was anything I needed at any moment. And our daughters are very like now she has 2 daughters. She just had her second baby. But her daughter is right in between Blythe and Jude. And so like we were just around each other all the time. And with all of that, spending time around them, you know, come fall 2020, Zach is like, hey, I am interested in you. I said, okay, ask me out. At the same time that another person was like, hey, I'm interested in you. And I said, okay, ask me out. And the second guy asked me out. And Zach didn't. And so I started dating the second guy. He ended up moving in with me because he needed a place to stay. So he was my roommate. Ended up being a very terrible situation.
Oh, gosh.
But it was like this whole thing where I was like, okay, like I'm dating this guy. And Zach was like, no, I'm going to ask you out. And I said, sorry, I'm dating someone else now. And he was like, oh, okay. And that was when I had mentioned the dream earlier where I had the dream and I was already starting to see these like red flags in the guy that I was dating who was living in my house with my children, where I was like, ooh, like you just seem unsafe. There are things happening and I don't think this is good. So I was already contemplating breaking up with him, but trying to figure out how do you break up with someone who lives in your house and watches your kids instead of paying rent. And I was like, okay, I don't know how to do this. And then I had this dream where God told me I was going to marry Zach. And I was like, I don't understand. I was like, it's probably just because I'm going to their house on Christmas and I'm going to see him and it's going to be awkward. And Christmas was the time, like the moment on Christmas morning, because we all 4 were together, that Zach said he looked over and was like, she could be my wife, sitting on the couch across from me. I had no idea at this point. And then in the midst of all of this, kind of going back to that joy and pain in both hands, Zach got news that his dad, who had a liver transplant for liver cancer 2 years prior, the cancer was back and he was going through treatment, and he was just kind of shook, like, okay, like he felt very confidently that God had told him that cancer was going to take his dad's life. And so he saw the last 2 years as this gift, but he was like, this is really heavy and really hard. And he was like, Leah is someone who knows grief like this. And so he was like, I'm going to talk to her about it. So we kind of started like fixing our friendship from that point. Like, okay, you can't ask me out because I'm dating someone else. So now we're going to work on the friendship side of things. And we started like talking fairly regularly about his dad. It was in that process that he got a call that his dad got a terminal diagnosis. He, I think, was given 6 to 8 months. I could have that number wrong. It may have been closer to a year. But with that, like Zach was talking to me about that, and he, you know, I was like, well, like, let's get together for lunch. And the night before the day we were going to have lunch, we were talking on the phone, and I had mentioned that in my dream I gave God the script, and Zach and I are talking, and all of a sudden he says word for word what I had told God I needed to believe that. And I was like, oh my gosh. And he was like, what? And I was like, hang on 1 second. So I went into my notes, I'd written it down, I screenshotted it, sent it to him, and he's like, okay, you wrote down what I said. And I said, no, I told God a month ago that if I was going to marry you, you needed to say this to me. And what he had said had in the same thing, that like we, we're going to be together and all that. And so we were like, okay, what do we do with this supernatural information? I'm still dating someone else that I'm trying to figure out how to break up with at this point. So I'm like, oh my gosh, what do we do?
Yeah, this is God being like, you asked for a sign and I'm going to give you a sign because it is time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we had lunch the next day, and I've talked to Zach like this is, and he already knew that I was planning on trying to figure out how to break up with this guy. And so like, he's kind of like, we're not dating, but we know that that's in our future. And then finally I reach a point where, it's January of 2021. I'm like, you know what? I have way too much going on. I've got, I just started EMDR therapy. I am coming up on my first court hearing for my divorce. I now have this information about Zach. I'm working 4 jobs at this point, 7 days a week, trying to pay all my bills. I've got 2 kids. I like, there's just way too much going on. And so I'm like, it's not worth waiting for the fallout anymore. Like, I just am going to break up with the guy. So I broke up with the guy the night before my first court hearing. January 20th. January 21st, I, get up early for my court hearing. It's all on WebEx or whatever. Yeah. And it's literally just supposed to be a preliminary, like going over all the information sort of a thing. And I jump on the call, and my first husband isn't getting on the call, and he's not there. And finally the judge is like, okay, I guess he's not coming. Let's get started. And I was like, oh, you do things without people here. Cool. Like, that's nice. So he like reads through it. It's literally all the paperwork we've been staring at for the last however many months. And he reads it and he goes, okay, looks like I've got both your signatures. The judge looks at me and he says, miss, would you like me to issue your decree of dissolution today? And I was like,
wow,
you can do that?
Happen.
Yeah. I was like, you can do that. And he was like, well, yeah, you both agreed to everything. You both signed everything. I'll issue it right now. He said, what do you want your name to be? And I said, hyphen, maiden, and married, so that I stay the same as my kids. He said, okay. And then he said, all right, we've concluded our business. Have a nice day. And I hung up, and I'm shaking and I'm crying. And I was like, what just happened? Like, what just happened?
It's done.
And
it's done.
Again, like, I don't know if I feel bad for this or not. But the one thing that was missing was the girls' social security numbers, because their dad had their social security cards because he needs to have them, is what I was told. And so I don't have them memorized. I'm not that kind of a human.
No,
and I was
neither.
like, well, I have to call him to get their social security numbers that was the last thing. I just had to call the lady and give her the social security numbers. So I called him and I was like, hey, I need the girls' social security numbers. And he was like, okay, is everything okay? And I said, well, that court hearing we had today? And he was like, oh no, like freaks out. He's like, I don't know how I missed that. What happened? Like, did I miss anything? And I said, well, we're divorced. And he was just silent. And I was like, okay, God, like, you've got this. And so I got that all squared away. The same day, Zach is going to Ohio to visit his dad for the first time since we got the terminal diagnosis. We had already agreed, knowing nothing about what this court hearing was going to do, was that we were going to pray this weekend while we were like physically apart. We were still talking and stuff, but while we were apart, we were going to both be praying about like, okay, what's the next step, God? And I literally called him right before he boarded, and I said, Zach, I'm divorced. And he was like, are you serious? Like, that's amazing. Like, told me congratulations. It was like a whole thing. Yeah. And so he gets back, and I pick him up from the airport. That became like our regular thing. He was going out once a month, I think. And I would pick him up from the airport, and we would kind of, talk through. I had the girls. And he was just like that was a big thing for me, was that you were still married. Yeah. And I'm a youth pastor, and I can't date a married woman. Like, even though it's literally just a legal piece of paper. He has
real morals or something.
I know. But for me, I was like, whatever. It's a freaking piece of paper. We've been separated for a year. Like, it doesn't matter. But he was like, now it's, like, that part is done. So we pray about the next step. So we told our best friends that he still lived with at the time that night when I got him home, like, hey, we are praying about what the next step is for us. We're not actually dating, but we know that this relationship is our future. And so that was somewhere in the mid-20s, January 31st, he asked me to be his girlfriend. And then, you know, it was just like this song and dance of like meeting each other's families. And, you know, with his dad, like he really wanted me to go out there, but I didn't want to like overshoot it. Like it was a weird thing, asking for time off. And then he had a trip at the beginning of March where he went out to see his dad and literally got home on a Monday and got a call. I think it was Tuesday that he needed to come back because his dad had taken a turn and, you know, this was it. And this was not what we had expected. And he was like, hey, if you can make it work, I would really like for you to be there. I said, well, I can't leave today. I've got a shift tomorrow, but I'll be on the flight. My mom booked my flight for me, and I ended up going out there. I was able to meet his dad in person and be with Zach when his dad passed. But that was something that a lot of people were like, hey, like, just so you know, like, his dad is going to die. Like, that's a thing. And it's going to destroy your relationship.
Oh, awesome. And thanks for speaking that over. Oh my gosh.
So a lot of people had very strong opiniens because I had literally just been legally divorced 10 days before we started dating. But I was actually just talking to my sister about this today. Like, we were going through a really intense thing and everyone said it was going to break us. And we both strongly believe that it's one of the reasons we are as strong as we are. Because it just... everything out the window, you got to get down to the nitty gritty and you have to be vulnerable and you have to be honest and you have to talk about these things. And so from there, we were engaged in April, married in July, found out we were pregnant end of September with our
and that was all 2021, right?
2021. So our third daughter was born June 7th of this year. And it's literally, people would look at us and be like, what else can you do in a year? We bought a house, we bought a car, we went on a couple different trips. We had a baby. All of these things. We were youth pastor and pastor's wife. And then we stepped down when I found out I was pregnant. Like, all of these crazy things were just happening back to back to back. And life was insane and it was busy. And through all of it, we were just like, man, like, there is no way this could be anything but God. Like, there is absolutely no way. And I think a big thing that I really felt in this last year specifically, because we actually had something scheduled almost exactly a year ago.
We were going to record for the last season of Created Worthy.
But a big thing that has changed in that year for me is realizing, again, there's joy and pain in both hands, and that neither of those is actually mine. You know, like,
Whoa. I have to stop you.
Yeah.
Can you say that again? That was so powerful. I have the Holy Spirit bumps for the 100th time. But
there is joy and pain in both hands, and neither of them is mine. And because my sister was asking, how do you do that?
Yeah.
And I said, well, I've always imagined it like this. And if you're not watching the visual, you won't get it. But my hands are in front of me and they're open. And there's joy and pain in both of them. And I can't hold on to either of them because it's not mine. And with that, also learning that what I give my time and energy to is my choice.
Yes.
There was a lot going on in November of last year where I was holding on to a ton of bitterness. And I've talked about really intense things that have happened to me, but I was holding on to a ton of bitterness against people and people's opinions and what people had said about me and Zach and what people had said about my ex-husband and what my ex-husband had done and all of these things. And I was just constantly like, I felt like I was griping about it all the time. And I was just angry. And I finally realized that I didn't have to give that my energy. I didn't have to give that my time and my emotions, and I didn't have to let that be something that controlled the rest of my life. Because yes, that's a part of my story and it's really powerful, and I think it needs to be said because there are going to be other women, other people in similar situations who need to know they're not alone.
Yes.
But I think the next step from that is to let it go in that it doesn't take our time anymore.
And it doesn't have power over you.
It doesn't. Because I caught myself so many times where I was missing moments with my children because I was pulling my hair out about something someone else had said, something someone else had done, all of these things where it's not what I wanted for my life.
Yeah.
It's not what I want.
Super interesting about just that position of joy and pain in both hands is also that this is a position of surrender. And that's something that I think I've been really pondering and thinking a lot about. And a lot of conviction about recently is like, really, what does surrender look like? And I'm very much like a picture person. Like I need a visual. And God just keeps putting this position of two open hands and then viewing everything in our lives as though they're in our hands.
Yeah.
And like how much strength and time and energy, like how uncomfortable it is to sit like this and be like, but all of these things, this, like I have this, or I don't have this, or this person said this about me, or whatever. But like, where in this position does that leave any room for God to be like, you are this?
Yeah.
Like, I'm going to pour back into you.
It's a position of receiving. I think about, we both went to the same church, so they would do the, the benediction. Is that what it's called? At the end, and you would open hands to receive it.
And I love that.
And it's one of the big things I miss about that, is the liturgy. But I think, like you're saying, like so much, it is a position of surrender, and realizing, a really impactful thing for me is that, my life was moments away from ending. When the paramedics arrived, they were
it's a miracle that
they were like,
alive
you are
right now.
Literally minutes from liver failure. Like, that's a thing. But realizing with that, like that, while it wasn't, me overcoming cancer or something that was out of my control, it was something that I had done to myself, but that my life is now on borrowed time, and that like I do not deserve the life I have left. And it wasn't that I deserved the life I had then, but what is left is a gift. It is given to me freely. And at the end of the day, it will be gone. It will be gone. So what am I doing with that time? What am I doing with the borrowedness of life? What am I doing with my resources, with my story? And, like I had said to you, like I have not shared this in a public way before. I've shared my suicide attempt in a public way, because that was always like, it was just me. I didn't really have to get into the nitty gritty, because I've always been scared of like, what if, someone's unhappy about what I have to say about them. But learning that it's not the impact on them that I really need to worry about. It's the impact of what God will do with my story, with having that spoken, having that out there. How many times have we met people and we have no idea what's actually going on because they haven't shared it, or we haven't taken the time to listen. And learning that like I need to be in this position of surrender of, it is my story, but it is God's story ultimately. Like it's not mine to hoard and keep private and safe. And, it's not, like you said, like I want to hold on to it. I want to protect myself. I want to make sure that I'm not going to get in trouble or have someone say something mean about me, because heaven forbid a 4 has their feelings hurt. But realizing just that like it is not mine to keep. Like God's grace is sufficient, and God's grace is all that I need. So I need to let my story be free. I need to let it be in the open hands of the joy and the pain, and not just shared, one-on-one with people. Like there's a point where we need to be louder so that we can be there for people.
And I think that the verbiage in the Bible, just to pull a little bit from the Bible, we overcome by the blood of the Lamb and the word of our testimony. What a power. That has always been one of my favorite verses. And I don't want to ever, I'm not a theologian, so I don't want to speak out of context, but I think that those words are very specific and applicable to every single person. It's kind of one of the pillars for Created Worthy, is like that we overcome, we receive, and we give other people freedom through telling the story that God has ultimately written for us. Yes, we make our own decisions, and we are responsible and accountable for our own decisions. But also God knows that we're going to make those decisions. Yeah. And he knows how those decisions play a bigger part in this much more ginormous puzzle and beautiful story. You sitting here sharing today for the first time, I think in entirety, is also a testimony of God's grace, his forgiveness, his love, how he builds resilience within us through giving us these, God, so on a side note, God We don't always need all of these trials, but thanks for letting us learn.
Yeah.
You know, but truly, honestly, like being able to say like, okay, that really sucked. And I went through something that I didn't deserve to go through. But there's a plan for that.
Yeah.
There's a purpose in that.
That's one of my favorite like visuals in my life now, though, is like I was talking about how Zach was one of those guys who broke my heart, moved to Texas. And I remember sitting on my bathroom floor. I don't remember what it said, but sitting on my bathroom floor reading a letter he gave me, sobbing at that time. But looking at it now and realizing that him going to Texas turned him into the man that he is today, the man that is my husband.
That was God's way of preparing him.
Preparing him and preparing me and Blythe and Jude for the season of life that we are in, to be with this man as a spiritual leader and guider and protector and best hugger in the world. You know, like I think about that, like we would not have Blythe and Jude in our family if he hadn't done that. And again, like 17-year-old heartbreak feels life-threatening in the moment.
For sure.
But in the grand scheme of things, like there were far worse things I was going to go through and probably will go through in life than that heartbreak. But it was something that was needed for us to be who we are, so that we are as compatible as we are now to be what God had for us. You know, because God did have us for each other. And I know that that's like a little like woohoo for some people. But like, you know, like the dreams and the speaking and all that. But God had that for us. And how beautiful it is that we get to appreciate that because we went through everything we did.
Yes. Yes, yes, yes. I could not agree more. And I'm really proud of you for sitting here today and for sharing your story with us and trusting me to, you know, put it out there.
Yeah.
I created this platform so that you could be here and share this story because God has created you as worthy. Like you are created worthy. That's why this exists. So before we wrap up, I would love for you to just share a little bit about your creative processing method. As you know, you've gone through a lot of things, especially in the last 5 years, 5+ years now. Is there any kind of creative outlet that you have clung on to and used as a processing method? And if not, then is there a creative outlet that you have or something that engages your creative mind that you could continue to use, to utilize as a tool that then would continue to help you process and grow and heal and gain clarity?
Yeah. I think like when I saw that question, like on your intake form, like the first thing that comes to mind is always writing. It's something that I've done, you know, since I was little, be it, you know, tiny journals or whatever. I remember writing a storybook when I was little about stories people had told us from when we were younger, you know, like in my grandmother's house. And I called it In Grandma's Back Room because that was like the back room is where we would all like hang out and have like giant cousin sleepovers in California. So writing is definitely like a big part of my creative processing. But I've learned in the last few years, like it used to be where I could just write and write and write. But then 2020 hit and I kind of wrote a little bit like here and there, but it was like there was like this stopper on the writing. And so sometimes what I end up doing is I make like voice memos of like whatever's in my brain. And then I go back and I re-listen to them, and like these ideas of like whatever I was having like kind of mature into this thing that then when I write, I'm like, wow, that's what it was supposed to be. Okay. Like it needed time to like kind of come to fruition. And so I don't know if there's a word for that, speaking to yourself in your phone.
It's like audio vlogging. Is I guess like ogging. We're coming up with a new term, okay?
But definitely like that has become more prevalent where like it's still like writing is the final form, but kind of just like mentally and verbally like speaking it into existence so that then like I kind of like what you're saying, like it's almost like a visual. If I I guess some people think in pictures. I think in words.
Okay,
See
me
the
too.
words in my head. So like once I speak it, then I can see it
Yeah.
as a word and then like process it from there. And music is also like a really big one for me. That or like my MO, if you will, is the 2005 Pride and Prejudice.
Okay.
Zach knows I am having a hard time if that movie's on.
Aww.
Because I like, it's just, I've watched it in so many seasons of life that watching it again kind of like brings it all back and makes me feel safe and comfortable, to where then like I am able to process. Like I've seen it so many times, I'm not actually watching it. It's just the background noise for whatever's going on.
It's a safe space for you to process what you're going through.
Yeah.
Which I think that's really... So creative processing workshops is something that I'm starting to dabble in and see if I can bring those to more people, because I think that, you know, setting an intentional time and space to process through whatever your certain intention is. And for those workshops specifically, I'll choose like an intention that, or a block that we all face all the time, i.e. one of them, I'm actually going to be speaking at a MOPS group early next year, and we're going to creatively process through motherhood. Yeah. Because we get caught up in our minds. Yeah. It's so easy for us to just be like, woo, okay, I'm dealing with this. Got like, what's going
hats
on?
All at once.
Exactly. Like, how do I balance this? But it all comes down to being able to be like, again, that position of receiving and surrender. Right. And that's kind of what I love about creative processing is like, one, it's something we're already doing subconsciously. We don't know. We don't necessarily have a term for it. But when we do know about it, when we know better, we do better. Yeah. And when we can use the ways that we already love to create or just like to process as like an actual tool, then we get stronger. Yeah. We build that muscle memory, and we're more resilient. Yeah. When we face that, you know, I'm really struggling in motherhood. Oh, but I learned how to creatively process through this so that I can have clarity. I can restore my joy, and I can find my strength. And really my whole thing behind it really will be to constantly be pointing to the Lord. Yeah. And if deep trauma comes up, that's where therapy is necessary, you know? Yeah. But how do you even know if you need that if you're not processing through what you're walking in currently?
Yeah, absolutely.
So yeah, that's just a kind of a side note, but that's why creative processing is still a part of this show and something that I talk about with all of my guests, because I want you to feel empowered to use the ways that you inherently create as growing blocks and building blocks for you to just dive into, use intentionally, process through the hard things that continue to come up. Because although life is much better now, right? I think we could say that you're in a much better season. Your husband loves and respects you, and you love and respect your husband, and your girls are growing up in the household that I assume you pictured. Like that's what you wanted them to grow up in. But there's still hard days.
Absolutely there is.
We still have hard days, and we need tools to be able to get through them. So yes, although your story is filled with the redemptive power of Jesus and the redemptive power of doing the work, right? To get to heal. Yeah. There's always healing to be done. And there's always things that cause that to continue to come up. So thank you for sharing your processing methods. And I would just love to encourage you to really dive into that. And when writer's block is a real thing, especially when it's an inherent gift. It's almost like for me, like that's my number one processing method is writing. And it's the number one thing that I do not want to do when I'm struggling. Yeah. But we got to do it. Yeah. That's doing the work.
Absolutely.
So, Leah, can you share just if listeners would like to connect with you, where they could, where are you at? Where could they find you?
Yeah, I am mostly present on Instagram, which is kind of like a weird space right now because I'm
me too.
Also a photographer. And so like visually, like I'm very like visually perfectly driven where I want things to look great, but I've kind of turned my Instagram into a standard mom with filters.
It happens to the best of us.
You know, like it's kind of a weird a weird space, but definitely Instagram is like an easy space to connect with me, see what's going on in my life, and also just reach out and message me.
Yeah.
I'm very open to talking and answering questions and also just listening if people need someone to listen to. And that's really like the primary space where like people can connect with me. I don't have like an active website or anything now, which I think is good for me.
Yeah,
it's
fair.
good.
Websites are a mess.
I had one honed in and then I took it down and now we're here. So
Instagram, and connect with her on Instagram. She is an incredible human. And I am just so honored that you are sitting here with me and have shared your story. Thank you, Leah. You are created worthy.
Thank you so much for having me, Danielle.
Thanks for tuning in to the Created Worthy podcast. If anything in today's show resonated with you, can you do me a huge favor and go leave a 5-star review? This helps more listeners find the show, and it also expands the impact, messages, and stories that are shared here. All the links and guest information are in the show notes. If you're on social media, I want to personally invite you to continue the conversations about these important topics that we're talking about. You can find Created Worthy on both Instagram and Facebook by just typing in Created Worthy Podcast. Can't wait to talk to you soon, friend. And don't forget, you are created worthy.